This move establishes central pawn control and opens diagonals for the queen and bishop, aiming for a solid foundation and flexibility in white's development. This move develops a knight towards the center and prepares for various solid defenses like the Indian defenses, keeping options open while contesting central control. This develops a knight towards the center while maintaining flexibility, preparing to either transpose into common defenses like the Queen's Indian or King's Indian, or to adopt a more positional approach. This move, 2, e6, signals Black's intention to enter a queen's pawn game structure, likely aiming for solid development and control of the center, potentially leading to defenses like the Queen's Gambit declined or an Indian defense variation. This move, 3, bf4, enters the London system, aiming for a solid and flexible setup by developing the bishop to an active diagonal before committing the d-pawn to d4. This move develops a minor piece, prepares castling, and supports the central pawn structure, fitting into the general principles of solid opening play. This move, h3, is a prophylactic measure, aiming to prevent any potential knight or bishop outpost on g4, thereby safeguarding the kingside structure. This move prepares to fianchetto the queenside bishop along the long diagonal, aiming to control the dark squares and challenge white's potentially expansive pawn structure. This move, nbd2, supports the d4 pawn and prepares to develop the queen's knight, potentially to c4 or b3, to exert pressure on Black's queenside pawn structure or support a central pawn push later on. This move challenges White's central pawn structure and aims to open lines for Black's pieces, potentially leading to dynamic play. This move solidifies the center and prepares to support the d4 pawn, creating a solid pawn chain while also allowing for potential development of the queen's bishop. This move activates the bishop and targets the c4 square, aiming to disrupt White's pawn structure and potentially gain a tempo if White moves the queen. This move strategically prepares for the eventual expansion in the center with d5, while simultaneously solidifying the pawn structure and offering support for the knight on d2. This move simplifies the position by exchanging a well-placed bishop for a knight, which often leads to structural advantages for White by creating an open c-file. This move recaptures the bishop, simplifying the position and allowing White to develop their knight to a more active central square, potentially preparing for kingside castling. This move prepares to reroute the queen to the c7 square, aiming to support the pawn advance to c5 and challenge White's control of the d4 square. This knight repositioning prepares to contest the d-file and support a potential queenside expansion while also reinforcing the central light squares. Castling kingside secures the king and prepares to connect the rooks, a standard developing move in this Queen's Indian setup. This move, k2, supports the central advance of the d4 pawn while also preparing to connect the rooks and potentially facilitate queenside activity. This move repositions the queen to a more active square, supporting the advance of the c-pawn and preparing to contest the d-file or potentially attack on the queenside. Castling kingside secures the monarch and prepares to connect the rooks, a vital step in most chess openings to activate these powerful pieces. This move actively contests the c-file, aiming to prevent White's potential pawn advance to c4 and to prepare for future play on the queenside. This move logically prepares to support the e4 pawn push, aiming to challenge Black's central control and open lines for White's pieces. This move, nc6, develops a minor piece to a central square, contesting White's d4 pawn and preparing for potential pawn advances like d5 or c4. This knight maneuver seeks to control key central squares and potentially exploit the weakened queenside pawn structure after black's capture on f1. This move is a strategic retreat to reposition the knight, preparing to potentially move it to g7 or f6 to reinforce the kingside and influence the central squares. This knight move reroutes the knight towards its more active central squares, potentially preparing to support a kingside pawn push or to contest key central squares. This move repositions the knight to the edge of the board, aiming to challenge white's central knight and potentially create queenside pressure. This move prepares to challenge black's control of the d-file and offers a strategic redeployment for the knight on c4, potentially reinforcing the center or supporting a queenside expansion. This pawn break challenges white's central control and aims to open lines for black's pieces, particularly the queen and rooks, by undermining the d4 pawn. This move initiates a dynamic exchange, aiming to provoke a weakness in black's kingside pawn structure and potentially exploit the open g-file for attacking chances. This move repositions the queen to a more active square, potentially eyeing the g2 pawn and challenging white's central control, while also preparing for future pawn breaks. This maneuver prepares to relocate the knight to a more active square, potentially targeting the weakened e6 pawn or supporting a kingside expansion. This move seeks to exploit the pin on white's knight on d2 and create immediate pressure on white's queenside infrastructure. This move intends to secure the rook from potential threats on the c-file and prepare its redistribution to a more active square. This move directly challenges white's knight on g4, seeking to disrupt white's kingside initiative and potentially open lines for black's own pieces. The knight retreats from the active square it occupied, likely aiming to reroute to f3 or g4 to support the kingside attack, while also avoiding the awkward pressure on the kingside caused by black's doubled pawns. Black's aggressive pawn thrust on g5 aims to destabilize white's kingside and potentially open lines for attack against the white king. This move sacrifices the bishop on g5 to disrupt black's kingside pawn structure and open the g-file for potential attack, creating dynamic imbalances after a relatively slow opening. By exchanging the bishop for white's knight, black disrupts white's central pawn structure and aims to simplify the position while opening lines for potential counterplay. This move sacrifices the queen for a rook and pawn, aiming to disrupt black's king safety and potentially create mating threats with the remaining pieces. The capture of the bishop on g5 has unfortunately opened up the h-file, allowing white's queen to become very active and attack your king, making defensive maneuvering crucial for black. The knight repositions to f1 to defend the e3 pawn and potentially support a future e4 advance, aiming to untangle white's pieces and prepare for the middle game. This move e7 aims to redeploy the knight, anticipating potential knight sacrifices on f5 and allowing the g-pawn to advance further, thereby creating a more solid pawn structure on the kingside. This move repositions the queen to a more active square, eyeing the kingside and preparing for potential pawn pushes like f4 while defending the d4 pawn. The move 23, qg6 aims to reposition the queen to a more active square, potentially attacking the weak h2 knight and supporting the g5 pawn. This move repositions the rook to the d-file, aiming to control the open file and support potential pawn advances on the queenside or a central pawn break. This move challenges white's rook on the d-file, preparing to activate the a8 rook and potentially create pressure along the queenside pawn chain. This pawn thrust ignites a crucial central tension, aiming to shatter black's pawn structure and open lines for white's pieces. This pawn thrust challenges white's pawn center and aims to create counterplay on the queenside, potentially opening lines for black's rook and bishop. This move boldly pushes the e-pawn, aiming to seize central space and potentially open lines for white's pieces, while challenging black's pawn chain. This move intrudes the knight into white's territory, seeking to disrupt white's queenside setup and potentially attack the advanced d5 pawn. This move challenges black's advanced queenside pawn structure and aims to disrupt white's coordination by forcing a response to the pawn on b3. This move repositions the knight to a more active central square, preparing to challenge white's queenside initiative and potentially create counterplay. The move k3 prepares to redeploy the queen, potentially supporting a central pawn push or a knight maneuver to f5, aiming to exploit black's somewhat exposed kingside and the misplaced knight on c4. This move aims to disrupt white's pawn structure and gain space on the queenside, potentially creating attacking chances on the queenside or forcing white to commit further on the other flank. This capture opens the d-file and creates dynamic pawn tension, forcing black to address the immediate threat to their pawn structure and potentially opening lines for white's rooks. This pawn capture opens the f-file for white's rook, creating immediate tactical threats against black's king and placing pressure on the kingside. This move 30. f4 initiates a critical pawn break, aiming to exploit black's slightly uncoordinated pieces and the weak g7 square to open lines for white's attack. This move injects a knight into the heart of white's position, challenging the advanced pawn and aiming to disrupt white's defensive setup by creating attacking chances against the king.